My name is Adarsh Pradeep. I actually work at Southwest Airlines, and I've actually been working here for 4.5 years now. And really today my goal is to talk to y'all about cybersecurity, about how you can potentially transition into this hot and growing field, as well as show you guys some uh, training resources and some best practices to get started in the industry, because there's a lot of myths and kind of smoke and mirrors around what cybersecurity is and what it actually is not. So moving right along, like I said, my background, I'm a cloud security software engineer today. I actually recently transitioned into this role about 3 months ago from being an information security analyst on the risk and compliance team. So I think what that means is I'm able to show you guys both types of roles in the industry today, which predominantly you can either be an analyst or you can be an engineer in the cybersecurity space. And even within engineering and analyst roles, there are lots of different types of niches that you can go into. So I actually started off as an analyst on the risk and compliance team, where I had domain expertise and responsibilities around vulnerability management, network security, application security, cloud security, risk management, and compliance and privacy policy. You might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of different domains that you worked across, and how did you do that in like around 4 years? The truth is, with the risk and compliance team, because we were working with so many different teams across not only technology, but across Southwest, it pretty much became my job to become kind of like a jack of all trades, master of none type role, where I had a wide breadth of knowledge, but not necessarily a huge depth of knowledge. And eventually I found out that I actually really liked vulnerability management, application security, and cloud security, which is why I eventually transitioned to a cloud security software engineer role, where I'm using my domain knowledge from risk management and privacy policy expertise to help define controls in the cloud environment, which we're using, which is AWS. And on the side, I also have a freelance consulting company which focuses on cloud and cybersecurity computing. It's called the Citron Group. So what is cybersecurity? For a lot of you, you may have seen either TV shows or the headlines, and it's always either hacking or quote unquote hacking, and I'll tell you why I put that in quotes. Cryptography, espionage, like in the spy movies or James Bond, or
So,
with cybersecurity, these are kind of like the preconceived notions of what cybersecurity is. So all these forensic research, CSI, espionage, cryptography, and hacking. But really, there's a lot more to cybersecurity than just these domains. And it initially turns off a lot of people because they think that if you can't be slotted into one of these niches, then, well, then I can't be in cybersecurity, which is not true. Uh, So there's a lot more to cybersecurity, and one of the many fields you can go into, of course, in cybersecurity is cloud security, which is very hot right now, and it's in the niche that I'm in right now. But there's everything from risk management to compliance. Privacy is a growing field. Application security, penetration testing, security awareness training, and project management even. So I can dive into a couple of these. So a big topic of interest for people is usually penetration testing, because penetration testing is the closest to the hacking term that you will probably get to, where you are being paid to break into systems and software environments that where you actually have permission to break into these systems, as opposed to doing gray area or black hat work, where you're kind of blurring the lines between what's legal and not legal. Another hot topic, like I said, is privacy. With the amount of data that is being shared by all types of companies and the amount of data that we are giving up as consumers, there are a lot of regulations now coming out in regards to privacy, whether it's GDPR from the European Union or CCPA, which is the California Consumer Privacy Act. They are basically defining what type of data can be shared, how it can be shared, and all these types of regulations that govern how companies can interact with customers' personal data. So that's a very fast-growing field that kind of blends legal and cybersecurity. So if you have legal or policy experience from other domains, that's an easy fit for you where you can come into privacy. Another one that I can definitely touch on is security awareness and training. That one is something that people are sometimes perplexed by, because security awareness and training is something that is more about designing curriculum. Or for example, this security training you're part of today with a webinar, getting industry insights into how a career professional like me does cybersecurity day in the field. That's part of security awareness. But the bottom line is cybersecurity is something that is everyone's job at a company, because ultimately it impacts all of us. It's not just cybersecurity team's responsibility. And that's because the human is ultimately the weakest link in any organization. You can have the strongest firewall or the most up-to-date security system, most up-to-date antivirus, great cloud security automation, and all these things. But all it takes is for some, in the case of Southwest, because we're an airline, some pilot or a flight attendant or even just a project manager or an engineer to click on a link that says, hey, click here for a free iPad, and just give us your employee credentials to verify your free iPad. And boom, they have keys to the kingdom, and they can start pivoting from there and getting access to very sensitive systems, and suddenly you have a breach. And that's why earlier in the presentation, I'd said that hacking in quotes is something that I like to poke fun at, because a lot of the hacking today that you see out in the real world is quite trivial when you actually start analyzing how the hack occurred. For example, the big one that was in the media recently was Equifax, where they had a ton of user information. I think 1/3 of the US population's information that was stolen and accessible. And that was largely due to terrible AWS S3 bucket practices, where they either left open S3 buckets or had poor access rights to it, where more people than there should be had access to these buckets. And honestly, that was something that would have been as simple as automating to say, hey, if a new bucket is created, make sure it's private. But unfortunately, there isn't a lot of awareness around these things, even with supposedly technical folks like traditional software engineers who just don't have the security mindset kind of driven into them, which is where security awareness and training plays a big role. So our security awareness and training coordinator on my previous team, on the risk and compliance team, she actually has an education and English background, and that actually works great for us because she's able to design curriculum and training that is most effective depending on the work group that we're trying to target. So the messaging for a customer service agent when you check into an aircraft is going to be a different type of user than a sysadmin who is responsible for network infrastructure. They have different technical skill sets and different appreciation of what kind of data they need to secure. And finally, the one field that I also think is very important and is pretty fun, which I was involved with, was risk management. Risk management is encompassing everything from balancing how much risk appetite, cybersecurity risk appetite, a company is willing to take, as well as working with the enterprise risk management team to see how traditional business risk, in the case of an airline, our flights flown, for example, the 737 MAX recently got grounded, which was an impact on our operations. So pairing that with cybersecurity risk, for example, the 737 MAX is the first E-connected aircraft by Boeing, where there's a lot of data that is fed over the air, things like updates or patches, things like that. So you have to be able to secure that kind of unique new environment. And for that, you have to have risk management play a role where you see the trade-off between your software's usage versus how much security you need. Because security is always a balance between convenience and security. So being able to evaluate that risk while working with different business divisions is a pretty cool intro to the field, I think. So Job Outlook, which you guys are probably interested in, ISACA, which is a prominent information security organization forum, predicts that there will be a global shortage of 2 million cybersecurity professionals by 2019. Well, we're in 2020 and that shortage is only growing. So there's huge demand, like I said, for cybersecurity professionals. And more importantly, the reason for this sudden big demand, which didn't frankly exist around 10 years ago, is because, for example, when Cisco says that 29% of breached organizations lost revenue, ultimately the board of directors, the CEO, and the C-suite, they care about the bottom line of the company. And historically, cybersecurity was seen more as a cost center, and it was just insurance, and it was like, hey, yes, we need this, but they couldn't see the tangible benefits of having it in place. Whereas now, organizations are starting to realize that cybersecurity is something that needs to be in the building block of application development, of technology infrastructure, because it's easier and cheaper to incorporate cybersecurity into a company's culture and a company's product from the ground than it is to recoup your brand's damage and your brand's reputation after an incident occurs that resulted from poor cybersecurity practices and a poor security culture. And you can see that from everywhere from Home Depot or Equifax or recently Capital One and all these organizations where they didn't necessarily prioritize cybersecurity. And honestly, Target was a big one as well, more so than Capital One. So in terms of determining whether cybersecurity is a good fit for you, I would look at things like, are you technical? When I say, are you technical, I don't necessarily mean, do you like coding all day, or are you someone that likes getting in the weeds of like firewall rules or something like that, or do you like hacking into systems? Which all of those are certainly valid, but it's more, when I say this question in a broad sense, it's more, are you the type of person when you look at a system, and when I say system, I mean something like a car or a phone or some new gadget you picked up, are you the kind of person that looks at how it works and looks at how you can exploit that system and how you can make that system work for you and essentially unravel the system and break it apart to see what kind of loopholes exist, what kind of things can you do with it that was not necessarily part of the system's design or intention. And that kind of mindset, the hacker mindset, if you will, plays a part regardless of what kind of cybersecurity role you're looking for, because essentially, regardless of all the domains I mentioned, you're looking to make sure that your organization and your employees are always one step ahead of the bad guys. So when you look at traditional law enforcement, you always have the cops and the robbers, right? The police and the robbers. And it's always been the case that the robbers are always one step ahead of the police force. And a lot of times that's thanks to the fact that police don't receive adequate training, or because they're a huge government institution, they don't have the same agility of a small like criminal outfit and things like that. So with the private sector, what's kind of cool is a lot of organizations are trying to be more agile and be more on the dime so that they can pivot and meet the latest threats that come out from these bad actors. So that's something to consider. The next thing to look at would be, do you enjoy working with others? Because as much as being a hacker or a pen tester, where that's probably the only role that you can get away with working largely with yourself in a remote location and going into systems, most of the other roles that I described traditionally requires you to coordinate with other engineering teams, other business teams, to make sure that you're providing a balanced approach to security. So for example, when I was on the risk and compliance team, anytime we created new cybersecurity policy or we were evaluating new cybersecurity products or even new technology products, we made sure to include legal, marketing, sales, and of course our software engineering teams to ensure that all these teams had consensus and we had a solution that worked to go around legal requirements, to go around marketing requirements, sales requirements, all these things to ensure that how security was built into the product was something that was seamless and was not seen as a hurdle for users. Because the more of a hurdle you make something like cybersecurity to users, the less likely they are to use it or to use it effectively, which ultimately leads to a higher risk of you being breached. And another question I would look at is, do you prefer business, engineering, or a mix of both? Because if you come from a business background, you may be more inclined to looking at certain cybersecurity niches such as project management, which project management in cybersecurity is not much different from project management in other business fields. You may be more inclined to look at risk management, which again, there's a counterpart to cybersecurity risk management in enterprise risk management, or compliance and privacy, which involves, like I said, a mix of legal and engineering. If you prefer engineering, you may be more inclined to go towards penetration testing, towards application security, cloud security engineering like I'm doing now, or even very technical analysis of policy. And if you prefer a mix of both, it may be a great idea for you to start on something like a compliance team or a threat intelligence team where you are actively working with technical folks and non-technical folks to derive your cybersecurity policies for the organization, to make sure that the threat intelligence you're getting matches up with the risks, the true risks in your environment, and things like that. And finally, I would look at what kind of background you currently have, because it's important to note that if you want to go into an engineering discipline in cybersecurity, but you only have business experience, it's going to be much harder to break in than the other way around. Because what I've seen, at least in cybersecurity, is if you come from an engineering background, but you've helped design engineering requirements around business requirements, then you're able to more easily transition into the business side of cybersecurity. Perhaps not business in other fields, but that's something that plays a role, because if you're coming from a business background, but you want to go into an engineering role, then it would be best for you to start off in something like a risk and compliance or a privacy role or even a project management role, and then try to get more technical projects or programs under your belt so that you can eventually transition to an engineering role if that's your ultimate goal. So technical roles, essential skills. What do you need to get into a technical role? I think I started touching on that in the last point, but essentially with cybersecurity, unlike with a lot of different other IT domains, the key is to have a wide breadth of knowledge across IT domains. I touched on this earlier where I said on the risk and compliance team, I was essentially a jack of all trades, master of none. I say that jokingly because there were some things that I mastered in there for sure, but ultimately your job is not to be the subject matter expert on every single type of security risk or every single type of IT infrastructure, but your job is to know enough about how these different systems interact with each other to be able to then correlate risk and tell teams how best to secure their environments. Because those teams will have a deep knowledge in their specific field of expertise, but won't necessarily know enough about the other fields in order to get a holistic picture of risk. And the next thing I would look at is your ability to analyze and evaluate technology risk in the environment. This is not something you will necessarily have when you go into the field. It's something you develop over time. And a lot of it actually stems from that wide breadth of knowledge that you want to gain across IT domains. So in relation to that wide breadth of knowledge across IT domains, what I would say is to focus on having a good grasp of basic networking concepts as well as basic software concepts. So essentially application security related concepts. And once you have a grasp of those and how those layers interact with each other, right? If you look at that, the model with the application layer, the presentation layer, the software layer, the TCP/IP stack, essentially, you are able to then see how all of those layers coordinate with each other and either help secure or present loopholes in one of the others. For example, if you have a very secure piece of software, but then on the networking side, you have firewall rules that open up that software to everyone in the world, you ultimately will have a much less secure piece of software. So looking at both of those things, and honestly, a great resource to help you start looking at these kind of risks objectively is OWASP. OWASP publishes a list of top 10 for application security, and I believe they publish a similar list for infrastructure and network security too, where you can look at that list and see what the top uh, major trends in cybersecurity vulnerabilities are in the industry today, which allows you to better correlate like the software vulnerabilities with the network vulnerabilities and see what kind of risk that poses to your environment. Next up is the creativity to understand loopholes or bugs in an application, network, or other system. That ties back to looking at software and network separately and looking at how those things interact with each other to create potential loopholes or blind spots or bugs. Uh, Eventually, you need to have a deep understanding of programming, networking, or both. It sounds contradictory when I said you should have a wide breadth of knowledge and then a deep understanding. What I mean is once you have this wide breadth of knowledge and you kind of come into the system and you've come into the cybersecurity space and you've started focusing in an enterprise environment, then you can pick what side you ultimately want to go into. It can be either application security or infrastructure security, and then you start drilling down into your niche if that's what you want to do. You can always be a wide breadth of knowledge kind of guy, be a generalist, and be kind of a consultant or a risk management type of person. But if you want to specialize, which a lot of people do because they find a lot of times that they get very passionate about a certain sect of cybersecurity, then it's a good idea to pick one of those and start concentrating in that. And finally, this is something that is a parallel to IT in general and tech in general, is keep up with the constantly evolving threat landscape. If you're a traditional software engineer, you know that you're probably keeping up with the latest and greatest in tool stacks or frameworks and basically ensuring that you're on the top of your game in terms of programming. If you're in project management or whatever it is, you're probably on top of agile or whatever new methodology comes out, right? Similarly with cybersecurity, it's at an even more hyper focused, hyper paced approach where the threat landscape is not dictated by an industry body like it would be with programming or with project management or business or whatever. It's determined by the bad guys, and they have a strong motivation to always be on their toes and one step ahead of the game because there's, I mean, financial motivation or some kind of motivation for them. And as a result, it's up to us as the defenders, if you will, to be able to constantly keep up with this evolving threat landscape, because as each new technology comes out from like the great programming houses of the world, whether it's a Google or some tech company comes out with, hey, we're doing this with machine learning, or, oh, we're doing this with artificial intelligence, suddenly there's going to be an equal or greater capacity to which those systems and those types of technologies can be hacked by bad actors. So being able to say, oh, this is machine learning and this is a new vulnerability for machine learning which can directly impact my system in this way is key to being a cybersecurity professional. Another role, of course, you can go into without technical roles is non-technical roles. But again, even with non-technical roles, you want to have a wide breadth of knowledge across IT domains. Again, like for the same reasons I mentioned before. And in this case, you'll want the ability to analyze and evaluate business and technology risks in the environment. And the reason I say this is because evaluating technology risks alone is great, and especially if you're in a technical role, it's definitely something that's will be in your wheelhouse. But if you're in a more non-technical role, you will largely be the liaison between the cybersecurity engineers and engineering functions and the rest of the business, whether it's marketing, sales, finance, legal, all those guys. And it's up to you to be able to decipher the requirements coming in from those other non-technical departments and correlating it with the risk those requirements may pose to your technology environments and determining what is the best course of action so that the balance of security and convenience, like I mentioned, can occur. And the next one, of course, ability to manage security requirements against product experience. That's what I just mentioned. Ability to work with multiple cross-functional teams. Like I said earlier, the reason for that is so that you can better paint a holistic picture of risk to those teams and be able to articulate uh, the risks that the business teams are bringing to the engineering folks as well. And finally, I can't reiterate, is you have to keep up with the constantly evolving threat landscape. It doesn't matter if you're a project manager or if you're a cybersecurity engineer. Chances are, whichever program you're working on in cybersecurity, you will be dealing with some new threat landscape or threat vulnerability that comes up that you will have to deal with as a course of events in your program. So it's always best to keep up with this. Finally, in terms of helpful resources, training, I would definitely recommend infosecacademy.io, and I've taken a look at the curriculum of Quick Start as well, and I'd say that they have a pretty great training program. Another one I would recommend is OWASP, just because OWASP is the industry open source. They're the kind of uh, pillar in cybersecurity, if you will, off of which most training is derived, whether it's for government or private sector, even Quick Start, whoever. I think they'll acknowledge OWASP as being a great resource. And then in terms of newsletters and blogs, scmagazine.com is one that I follow regularly. They seem to really give you the insights that you need, really accurate, really up to date, and sometimes ahead of a lot of the other blogs that I follow. And it's no nonsense. There's not any marketing or any kind of, oh, buy this tool or subscribe to this paid newsletter or anything like that. And Naked Security from Sophos. Sophos is an antivirus company. They have some pretty cool researchers that do a lot of analytics on the latest threats, and they do some types of uh, autopsies of famous breaches. So they're a good blog to follow as well. And that concludes my presentation.